All right, guys. So if you remember from our previous lesson, FDR's New Deal was doing a pretty good job at fixing the Depression. But was it going to be enough? Well, stick around in this lesson because that's what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to talk about the Second New Deal and how it pushed ahead. Specifically, we're going to try to answer the question, what major issues did the Second New Deal address and what challenges did it face? So make sure you have like a pencil and paper out or some notes out. Get ready to take some notes. And hopefully by the end of the video, you'll have a good answer to this question. So FDR's first New Deal was pretty successful, but it really wasn't quite enough for the American people. In 1935, FDR introduced his second New Deal. This time, we're going to focus on the elderly, old people, right? Poor, unemployed, and workers' rights. Think of this as kind of as a New Deal. So FDR had really hit on a formula that worked with his first New Deal. So when it came time for the second New Deal, he really didn't change a whole lot. He just kept on going with the alphabet soup that he started with. In the second New Deal, one of the first major bits of legislation that FDR gets passed is the Works Progress Administration, or the WPA. The main focus of this program was jobs. When it was all said and done, the WPA wound up employing almost 8 million people. It did things like improve roads. In fact, it built around about 650,000 miles worth of roads across the United States. It also built roughly around 125,000 buildings, mostly government type buildings across the United States. But it also employed people that were artists, people like writers or photographers or artists. In order to employ 8 million people, a part of this program, you have to have a serious payroll. So how much did the WPA wind up costing the federal government? The answer is it almost cost about $11 billion. That's billion with a B, right? In the 1930s, that was a huge sum of money that the government was spending to try to jumpstart the economy. So why would the government be willing to spend such a huge sum of money in the middle of a depression to try to get America back on its feet? And a lot of it comes down to an idea and a concept called Keynesian economics. This idea was pioneered by a guy named John Maynard Keynes. He was an economist. And what Keynesian economics is a thing called deficit spending. Basically, the idea is you spend money up front to be able to make that money later. Basically, you spend the money to jumpstart the economy. So Keynes said that this concept was all about priming the pump. And in this case, the pump was the American economy. So the idea was if the government spends money, right, that it'll ultimately eventually get a return on its investment, right? Another very important second New Deal bit of legislation that gets passed is the Social Security Act, or the SSA. This basically provided a pension system for retired workers. So when you'd worked as much as you possibly could, work, and you were basically done with your working life, you could still get some sort of income from the government. And that's what Social Security is. This program also helped to supply some unemployment insurance. So if you lost your job at no fault of your own, say that you were maybe laid off from the business you were working for, or that the business you were working for closed up, right? It went out of business. You could get a small amount of money from the government to try to help you out in the meantime until you can find a new job. The Social Security Act also helped provide aid for mothers and children in poverty, or people that were disabled and just couldn't find work. When it's all said and done, the Social Security Act might be the most popular part of the New Deal as a whole. As I had mentioned before, one of the main goals of the Second New Deal was to help workers with their rights. That's where something called the Wagner Act comes into play. So the Wagner Act recognized the right of workers to be able to join labor unions. They could use collective bargaining and try to do their best to keep their jobs, to make a decent wage, things like that. Under the Wagner Act, the government also set up a thing called the National Labor Relations Board. And this was a group that would look into complaints that workers could file against their employers for all sorts of different things. Along those same lines, the government passed the Fair Labor Standards Act. This established a minimum wage, which at this time was 25 cents an hour, right? Not very much at all. It also set a maximum work week for people that were in the workforce, and it was set at 44 hours per week. So if you worked more than 44 hours, you had to be paid extra, some sort of overtime pay. And this law, it also outlawed child labor. If you are a child under the age of 16, legally you could not work during school hours, thanks to this law. So with these reforms, by the time the 1936 presidential election rolled down, it was very clear that people were very happy with what FDR was doing with his New Deal. So if you look at this map, you can see that Roosevelt carried every single state during the election except for 2 during the 1936 election. He won hands down by a huge landslide. And this gave him a chance to continue on with his New Deal. Now, the Second New Deal was not without its opposition. Just like the First New Deal, the Second New Deal didn't have some opposition. The Supreme Court wound up striking down several parts of the New Deal. A lot of the justices on the Supreme Court at this time were pretty much old school Republicans, and they didn't like that the government was interfering with business. Remember that the Republicans wanted a laissez-faire government, right? Where the government did not get involved in the economy. Clearly, FDR's government was. And so the Supreme Court, many of the justices didn't like that. And Roosevelt sought to try to fix this problem in a plan that becomes known as the Supreme Court Packing Plan. So after he was elected for a second term, Roosevelt pushed to add more Supreme Court justices. Back then, there were just 5 justices on the Supreme Court. And FDR proposed adding 6 more justices. And it turns out that, as the president, FDR himself had the power to appoint those 6 new justices if his plan were to be successful. This gave Roosevelt a clear chance to take control of the Supreme Court, which would make the Supreme Court more friendly and not able to oppose a lot of the New Deal programs that he wanted. Unfortunately for Roosevelt, the plan failed. The Supreme Court remained at 5 justices. But since then, they decided to kind of play nice with Roosevelt after he hinted at doing this. The Supreme Court, they just started to not oppose his programs as much. They really didn't mess too much with what Roosevelt was trying to do. But still, the Supreme Court Packing Plan, it actually ends up biting FDR in the butt. He got a lot of bad press for it. A lot of American people saw this as nothing more than a big power grab. And that really didn't sit well with the American people. And it took a little while for the American people to trust Roosevelt again. He would eventually get their trust back, but unfortunately for him, that didn't really happen until we entered into World War II. So what you need to take away from this part of the video about the Second New Deal is, number 1, remember that the New Deal was a success, but not quite enough. Number 2, it was going to take more alphabet soup to really help the economy. And number 3, helping the workers was essential for the Second New Deal. So there you go, guys, the Second New Deal pushing ahead. So it's pretty easy to argue that FDR in the New Deal, they were kind of a big deal. They did a lot to help America during the Great Depression. They even had some pretty lasting effects on us. And what were those lasting effects? Well, we're going to talk about that now. So today we're going to talk about also the effects of the New Deal. Specifically, we're going to answer the question, how did FDR and the New Deal change American politics? One of the first big changes the New Deal and FDR had on American politics was the role of women. One of the best examples of this is FDR's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt. Remember that she was kind of his eyes and ears. She was out there trying to figure out exactly what the mood of the country was, and she would report back to him, and he would actually listen to her. Before Eleanor Roosevelt showed up, the First Lady was more of a social figure. Not to kind of make light of the First Ladyship, but most First Ladies before Eleanor Roosevelt were really kind of just party planners, and that was about it. But it goes way beyond that, way beyond just Eleanor Roosevelt and the changing role of the First Lady. Women's role in politics changed even more significantly. Frances Perkins was the first female cabinet member. FDR appointed her to be the Secretary of Labor in his presidential cabinet. She was pretty much in charge of making sure everything was going good with the labor force here in the United States. And think about just how important the labor force was for America's economy, especially during the Great Depression. And she was now put in charge of that. Even before Frances Perkins, FDR was really expanding the woman's role in politics. A prime example is a lady named Mary McLeod Bethune. And she was the first Black woman to head up a federal agency. And she was the director of the Negro Affairs to the National Youth Administration. This was basically an organization in the government that was trying to help young African Americans. And speaking of African Americans, FDR really pushed to change their role in the government. We talked about, remember Woodrow Wilson kind of segregated the federal government, and it was a step backward for African Americans. Well, FDR undid that. He really pushed to change their role in the government. So we've talked about FDR's brain trust, but FDR also had what he called his Black Cabinet. Their official name was the Federal Council of Negro Affairs. Sometimes they're referred to as the Black Brain Trust. This group of African Americans really advised the president on specifically African American issues. And it turns out, for the most part, that FDR really listened to what they had to say and took most of that with him when he was planning out the New Deal. FDR and the New Deal also really kind of changed how the government interacted with the Native American population. The Indian Reorganization Act did a lot to try to help Native Americans. So, for example, it provided a lot of economic assistance for them. It also gave them a lot of control back that they had kind of lost over the years. It also gave them a kind of autonomy. They were more or less allowed to kind of do whatever they wanted to on the reservations, on the Indian reservations. FDR also really encouraged, with his New Deal, Native Americans to go back to practicing their original customs and speaking their own language. All of that stuff that before had kind of been beat out of them, right? He was trying to undo some of that damage. And because of this, FDR had a very diverse following. The New Deal coalition, as they kind of became known, was FDR's backers, his supporters, the people that really were supporting what he was doing. And they were made up of all sorts of people, not just your stereotypical Democrats. You had Southern whites, a lot of Northern blue-collar workers, and all sorts of African Americans really wanted to see FDR and his New Deal succeed. And this coalition gave a whole lot of strength to the Democratic Party in general, and it allowed them to kind of be a dominating force for a pretty long time. And under the New Deal and FDR, you also saw a huge expansion of the role, of the power of the federal government. The government took on a much larger role in the economy. Pretty much they about totally abandoned that laissez-faire attitude that we had taken before this. That laissez-faire attitude of the Gilded Age was no more. The United States became what was known as a welfare state. The government actually took responsibility for its citizens. It helped those citizens that weren't able to help themselves. And we also really saw a change in the nature of the presidency itself. Before FDR, for the most part, the president was kind of separated from the American people. There really wasn't a whole lot of interaction. Then FDR comes around and he communicates directly with the American people. Remember those fireside chats that we talked about. FDR took an active role to make sure that every American knew exactly what was going on. And he also wanted to, for the most part, hear exactly what all the American people wanted from him as president. So I know you're probably thinking, by this point, Mr. Webster, did the New Deal actually end the Depression for America? Well, the answer to that question is no. But that no is followed by a but. The New Deal really didn't end the Depression per se. It did, however, provide all sorts of relief and jobs for the American people. The New Deal definitely got the economy rolling again. It was only really a matter of time that eventually the New Deal probably would have put an end to the Depression. Unfortunately, a tiny little thing called World War II sort of got in the way of that. And when the war happened, the Depression ended really quickly. And you'll talk more about that when you talk about World War II with Mr. Painter next semester. So the New Deal also established lasting legislation. One of the big things the New Deal accomplished was that it kept another depression from happening again. Now, there have been a lot of the close calls since the 1930s, but we've never really slumped into that bad of an economic situation as we did during the Great Depression because of these reforms. So, all right, what's important to take away from this lesson? Number one, remember that the role of women in politics really changed because of FDR and the New Deal. Number two, remember that minorities to some degree really had a lot to say under the New Deal. And lastly, number three, remember that under the New Deal, the role of the government was greatly expanded. So there you go, guys, the effects of the New Deal. Hopefully you got some great notes out of it. Be ready for that final. Let me know if you have any questions in the meantime.